When billionaire Victor Kane died, his greedy family inherited skyscrapers, luxury penthouses, and millions in cash, while Ethan Kane was humiliated with a collapsing old forge buried in debt. But hidden beneath the rust and ashes was a secret no one else could see, because only someone who truly understood steel could unlock it. If you're enjoying this story, give it a like, share it with someone who loves hidden treasure mysteries, and subscribe for more stories like this. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. The tension inside Harrison and Cole attorneys felt thick enough to choke on. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and white across the glass. The conference room itself looked more like a private investment bank than a law office. Polished black walnut table, soft recessed lighting, 12 perfectly aligned leather chairs that probably cost more than Ethan Kane's truck. Everything about the room screamed old money. Controlled money. The kind of wealth built over generations and protected like a religion. At the far end of the table sat Ethan, quietly turning a paper coffee cup between his hands while the rest of the Kane family waited for the reading of Victor Kane's will. Nobody spoke much. They didn't need to. In families like this, silence was usually just another form of competition. Daniel Kane sat closest to the attorney, exactly where everyone expected him to sit. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, silver cufflinks, and the relaxed confidence of a man who already believed the empire belonged to him. Beside him sat Olivia Kane, elegant and sharp-eyed in a black designer dress, scrolling through her phone with practiced indifference, even though she kept glancing toward the leather folder sitting in front of the lawyer every few seconds. Neither of them looked sad. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Victor Kane had only been dead for 6 days, but grief wasn't really part of the atmosphere in that room. Anticipation was. Calculation. Everybody there was silently measuring what their percentage of the old man's fortune might look like by the end of the afternoon. And honestly, Ethan couldn't even blame them. Victor Kane hadn't just been rich. He'd been one of those larger-than-life American industrialists whose name ended up stamped on skyscrapers, universities, and museum wings. Kane Industries owned steel manufacturing plants across the country, luxury hotels in half a dozen major cities, shipping interests overseas, and enough real estate to make most billionaires jealous. Business magazines called him brilliant. Employees called him terrifying. Competitors called him ruthless when cameras weren't around. Ethan just called him grandfather, or at least he used to. The old man had stopped speaking to him almost 8 years ago, not after some dramatic family betrayal. Not because of money. The truth was actually simpler than that. Ethan disappointed him. In the Kane family, sons became executives, investors, attorneys, politicians. They inherited board seats and learned how to manipulate rooms before they learned how to shave. But Ethan never fit inside that world. Even as a kid, he cared more about how things were made than how much they were worth. While Daniel studied stock markets, Ethan spent summers welding scrap metal behind a repair shop in Brooklyn. At 16, he became obsessed with antique blades and steel restoration. By 24, he was working full-time restoring historical metalwork for collectors and museums instead of taking the 6-figure corporate position Victor personally arranged for him inside Kane Industries. Victor never understood that decision. "You were throwing away a dynasty to play with rusted steel," he told Ethan during one of their last real conversations. Ethan still remembered answering, "At least I'm building something real." That conversation ended exactly the way most conversations with Victor Kane ended: cold silence and a slammed door. Now the old man was dead, and somehow Ethan had still shown up. The attorney finally cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming, as requested by Mether. Victor Kane, all estate proceedings today will remain strictly confidential." Nobody responded. The rain outside only grew louder. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and opened the thick leather folder in front of him. "We all begin with primary holdings and liquid assets." And just like that, the feeding frenzy quietly began. Daniel inherited controlling interest in Kane Industries. No surprise there. Olivia received the Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, several investment portfolios, and offshore accounts nobody openly acknowledged existed. Another relative inherited the Aspen properties. Someone else got the yacht. A cousin Ethan barely recognized inherited a private vineyard in Napa. Each announcement subtly changed the mood in the room. Shoulders relaxed, tiny smiles appeared. The tension slowly transformed into greed made visible. Nobody even tried hiding it anymore. Meanwhile, Ethan just sat there listening, strangely detached from all of it. He hadn't expected anything from Victor Kane. Honestly, he would have been shocked if the old man left him $1. The only reason Ethan attended at all was because ignoring a summons from the Kane estate would have created more drama than simply sitting through it. The attorney turned another page. Then another. Eventually the room began settling into the assumption that Ethan truly had been cut out completely. Then the attorney stopped. It wasn't dramatic, just slightly too long. Long enough for everyone to notice. The lawyer looked down at the final page before adjusting his glasses again. Lastly, he said carefully, to Ethan Kane. Olivia immediately smirked. Daniel leaned back in his chair with open curiosity, now almost entertained. Ethan felt his stomach tighten anyway, because Victor Kane never did anything accidentally. The attorney folded his hands together. Mayor. Victor Kane leaves you sole ownership of the Blackforge property located outside Silverton, Colorado. For a second, nobody reacted. Then Olivia laughed. Not politely either. A genuine laugh she clearly failed to stop in time. Oh my God, she muttered, covering her mouth. Even Daniel shook his head slowly. That's brutal. But Ethan wasn't laughing. Because unlike most people in the room, he actually knew what Blackforge was. 20 years ago, Victor Kane purchased an abandoned industrial forge buried deep in the Colorado mountains. Rumor said he originally planned turning the land into a luxury retreat for wealthy clients. But environmental regulations killed the project before construction ever started. After that, Victor simply abandoned the property altogether. Over the years, Blackforge developed a reputation somewhere between local legend and financial disaster. The buildings were falling apart. The land carried massive back taxes. Harsh winters had practically destroyed the main structure. Nobody wanted it. And now it belonged to Ethan. The attorney slid another document across the table. There is one additional matter attached to the property. Of course there was. The estate will not be covering the outstanding tax debt tied to Blackforge. By accepting ownership, Mayor Kane also accepts responsibility for approximately $387,000 unpaid county taxes and structural penalties. This time Daniel actually laughed under his breath. Olivia leaned back in her chair, smiling openly now. Wow, he really hated you. Ethan stared down at the paperwork without touching it. $387,000. For a collapsing forge in the middle of nowhere. Victor Kane's final message couldn't have been clearer if he'd carved it into stone himself. Everyone else inherited the future. Ethan inherited a ruin. But something about it felt wrong. Not emotional wrong. Victor had always been cruel. Ethan made peace with that years ago. No, this felt calculated. Specific. Victor Kane didn't waste moves. Every insult the old man ever delivered had purpose behind it. That was what made him dangerous. And suddenly Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Blackforge wasn't just another insult. It was something else. Something hidden underneath the surface. The attorney pushed the documents closer. Do you accept the transfer of ownership? The room went quiet again. Ethan could practically feel his family waiting for him to refuse. Waiting for him to finally look defeated. Instead, he reached forward, picked up the old brass keys sitting beside the paperwork, and slipped them into his jacket pocket. Then he signed his name. Ethan left Manhattan before sunrise the next morning. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Not that anybody in the Kane family would, if he cared enough to ask. The city disappeared behind him in slow layers of gray concrete and wet highway as he drove west in his old black pickup truck, one hand resting on the wheel, the other occasionally touching the ring of brass keys sitting in the cup holder beside him. He still couldn't decide whether Victor Kane had handed him an insult or a challenge. Maybe both. The drive took nearly 2 full days. By the time Ethan crossed into Colorado, the skyscrapers and crowded highways had been replaced by pine forests, steep mountain roads, and long empty stretches where radio stations dissolved into static. The further he drove, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no phone calls, no family lawyers. Just the sound of tires against pavement and cold mountain wind rattling against the truck. Silverton itself barely looked like a real town anymore. It sat tucked deep in the mountains like something forgotten by time, old brick storefronts, rusted signs, diners with flickering neon lights. Ethan stopped once for coffee at a gas station outside town, and when he mentioned Blackforge to the older cashier behind the register, the woman actually paused mid-pour. You heading up there alone? She asked. Ethan nodded. The woman hesitated. Place gives people bad feelings. He almost smiled at that. It's just an abandoned forge. That's not what I heard. She didn't elaborate. Neither did he. 20 minutes later, Ethan turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt trail winding deeper into the mountains. The weather had shifted fast. Dark clouds rolled low across the peaks, and cold rain tapped steadily against the windshield. Pine trees crowded both sides of the road, so tightly that parts of the drive felt more like entering a tunnel than climbing a mountain. Then finally, after another mile of rough terrain, Ethan saw it. Blackforge. Even through the rain and fog, the place looked enormous. The forge sat at the base of a rocky mountain ridge surrounded by dead trees and rusted fencing half swallowed by weeds. The main building stretched wider than Ethan expected. Built from blackened brick and reinforced steel beams darkened by decades of smoke and weather. One side of the roof had partially collapsed inward. Broken windows stared out from the structure like empty eye sockets. Rust streaked down the walls beneath old iron fixtures. The entire property looked less like a workshop and more like the remains of some industrial cathedral left to rot in silence. Ethan killed the engine but stayed sitting there for a moment. Rain hit the hood softly. The place felt wrong. Not haunted exactly. Just heavy, like the mountain itself was trying to bury it. He finally stepped out of the truck, boots crunching across wet gravel. Cold wind immediately cut through his jacket, carrying the smell of rainwater, rust, and old ash. Somewhere nearby, loose sheet metal groaned softly in the wind. The closer Ethan got to the forge, the more details he noticed. Massive iron chains still hung near the loading entrance. Rusted rail tracks disappeared beneath weeds leading toward the rear of the building. Above the main doors sat the faded remains of an iron emblem, shaped like a hammer striking an anvil. Blackforge Steelworks. Most of the letters had fallen away years ago. Ethan unlocked the heavy front doors with one of the brass keys from Victor's estate. The hinges screamed loudly as the doors pushed inward, echoing through the darkness inside. The smell hit him first. Burned metal. Wet wood. Oil, dust, and beneath all of it something older. Something almost buried underneath the decades. He stepped inside slowly. The main forge floor was massive, larger than any private workshop Ethan had ever seen. Rusted industrial hammers stood frozen in place beneath overhead beams blackened with soot. Worktables stretched across the room covered in old tools and thick layers of dust. Chains hung from ceiling pulleys. Rainwater dripped steadily through cracks in the roof into shallow puddles scattered across the concrete floor. But even abandoned, the place still carried presence. Ethan had spent most of his adult life around metal shops, restoration yards, and historical workshops. He understood how these places aged. Most abandoned buildings slowly felt dead over time. Blackforge didn't. It felt asleep. He walked deeper inside, flashlight sweeping slowly across the darkness. Along the walls he found old furnaces large enough to melt industrial steel. Most were cold and rusted shut, but one near the center of the forge immediately caught his attention. Because it wasn't rusted, at least not completely. Ethan crouched beside it, brushing dust and ash away with his hand. The furnace itself looked ancient, probably custom, built decades earlier, but parts of the steel vent system looked strangely newer than everything around it. Not modern exactly, just maintained. That made no sense. According to county records, nobody had operated Blackforge in nearly 15 years. So why did portions of the ventilation system look repaired? Ethan stood slowly, studying the forge floor more carefully now. That was when he noticed the heat markings. Years working with steel had trained his eyes to spot things most people ignored. Burn patterns, airflow stains, temperature discoloration. Tiny details that revealed how heat moved through a structure. And Blackforge's heat patterns were wrong. Very wrong. The furnace vents extended downward beneath the concrete, instead of outward through the walls like a normal forge design. Even stranger, the floor beneath the central furnace showed faint stress fractures in perfect rectangular lines, almost hidden beneath soot and dust. Ethan's pulse slowed slightly. Now he was interested. He grabbed a long steel rod leaning against a nearby workbench and tapped the concrete floor near the furnace. Solid. He moved 2 feet left and tapped again. Different sound. Not hollow exactly. Layered. Ethan frowned and crouched lower, running his fingers across the cracks in the floor. They weren't random. The lines formed sharp edges too precise to happen naturally. Someone built something underneath this forge. A loud metallic bang suddenly echoed somewhere deeper inside the building. Ethan spun instantly toward the darkness. Silence. Only rain. For a second he just stood there listening carefully. Nothing moved. Probably loose metal shifting in the storm. Still, the sound tightened something in his chest. He turned back toward the furnace, flashlight beam moving across the old steel structure one more time. Then he saw it. Near the bottom vent, partially hidden beneath soot and grime, sat a small iron plate stamped with numbers. 200F. Ethan stared at it. Not a serial number. A temperature. Specific, intentional. And suddenly Victor Kane's final words inside that Manhattan office echoed back into Ethan's mind. Blackforge wasn't random. Victor wanted him here. Because this place wasn't just abandoned property. It was a lock. And Ethan was starting to realize he might be the only person in the family capable of opening it. Ethan barely slept that night. The small office above the forge still had power somehow, though only one dim yellow lamp worked near the desk. He sat there for hours listening to the storm outside while old pipes groaned inside the walls around him. Every once in a while the mountain wind would hit the side of the building hard enough to make the entire structure creak like an old ship at sea. Most people probably would be left by now. The place was freezing, isolated, and falling apart one winter storm away from collapse. But Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the furnace. 2,200 degrees. Not random. Nothing Victor Kane ever did was random. Around 3 in the morning Ethan finally gave up pretending he was going to sleep. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and headed back down onto the forge floor. The building looked even larger at night. Shadows swallowed entire sections of the workshop, while rainwater dripped steadily from broken ceiling panels high above. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching rusted chains and old steel tools hanging motionless like relics from another century. The central furnace sat exactly where he left it. Waiting. Ethan crouched beside the old iron structure again, studying every inch more carefully this time. Whoever designed Blackforge understood industrial engineering at an almost obsessive level. The furnace wasn't simply built into the floor, it connected directly into a network of reinforced steel ducts running underneath the concrete itself. Most people would never notice it. But Ethan spent half his life around metalwork. He knew how furnaces breathed. Heat required airflow, pressure, venting. And Blackforge's system didn't make sense unless the furnace was powering something below the forge. He ran his hand along one of the lower steel vents, cold, dead, but still intact. That was the strange part. Even abandoned buildings decay unevenly. Moisture destroys some sections faster than others, steel weakens, bolts fail. But these lower mechanisms looked maintained somehow, hidden from the weather, preserved, almost protected. Ethan stood slowly and scanned the forge floor again. Then his eyes landed on the massive coal hopper near the rear wall. Rust covered most of it except for the lower release wheel near the base. Cleaner metal. Recent scratches. Someone had used it. Not recently maybe, but more recently than the rest of the forge. His pulse picked up slightly. Ethan crossed the room and grabbed the wheel with both hands. At first it refused to move. Then with a violent metallic groan, the mechanism suddenly loosened. A heavy avalanche of old coal and black dust crashed down into the furnace feed system beneath the floor. The sound echoed through the forge. Then silence. A few seconds later, somewhere deep underneath the concrete, Ethan heard it. Thunk. He froze instantly. That wasn't the sound of shifting debris. That sounded mechanical. Deliberate. Slowly Ethan turned back toward the central furnace. For the first time since entering Blackforge, fear crept into his chest. Not because he thought somebody was down there. Because suddenly he was sure something was. He walked back carefully, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand now. The furnace itself looked unchanged, but the low steel pipes beneath it now carried a faint sound through the metal. Airflow. Somewhere deep below the forge, ancient ventilation systems were beginning to wake up. Ethan stared down at the iron plate again. 2 to an F. Then finally it clicked. This wasn't just a furnace. It was a key. Victor Kane hadn't hidden a keypad, or a vault door, or some Hollywood-style secret switch hidden behind a bookshelf. He built a lock only a metalsmith would understand. Ethan moved fast after that. The forge still had backup propane tanks outside near the loading area. Most were empty, but after searching nearly 20 minutes in the freezing rain, he finally found one with enough pressure remaining to feed the furnace lines. By sunrise, he'd managed to reconnect part of the old ignition system, manually using spare wiring and portable batteries from his truck. Danger, absolutely. But Ethan understood furnaces the way mechanics understand engines. And slowly, unbelievably, Blackforge began coming back to life. The first ignition sounded like a shotgun blast. Flames roared suddenly inside the furnace chamber, sending sparks bursting upward through the vent shafts. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere inside the walls, old pipes groaned violently as heat spread through systems untouched for years. Ethan stepped back, shielding his face from the sudden wave of heat. Then he smiled for the first time since arriving. Because underneath the decay, Blackforge still worked. Hours passed. The temperature gauge climbed painfully slowly while Ethan fed fuel into the system by hand. The forge grew hotter and louder with every passing minute. Metal beams popped from thermal expansion. Ancient ventilation fans buried somewhere beneath the structure slowly began turning again with deep grinding noises. 1800 degrees. 1991. Sweat soaked through Ethan's shirt despite the freezing mountain air outside. Then finally, 225. At first nothing happened. Ethan actually laughed once under his breath, exhausted and disappointed. Maybe he'd built the entire mystery up in his head. Maybe Victor really had dumped a worthless ruin on him after all. Then the floor moved. A deep metallic clunk echoed beneath the forge, followed by a violent hiss of escaping pressure. Dust exploded upward from cracks in the concrete floor around the furnace. Ethan stumbled backward instinctively as ancient hidden mechanisms groaned awake beneath his feet. The sound was enormous, like some giant machine dragging itself out of sleep after decades underground. Then slowly, almost impossibly, a section of the forge floor began sliding sideways. Not upward. Sideways. Perfectly smooth despite its size. Ethan stared in disbelief as a massive rectangular platform disappeared into the darkness below, revealing a hidden shaft beneath the furnace itself. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the smell of steel, oil, and something strangely clean. Not decay, not abandonment. Preservation. Lights flickered on below one by one automatically, illuminating a staircase descending deep beneath the mountain. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. Victor Kane built this. Not just a vault, an entire underground structure hidden beneath Blackforge. For several seconds Ethan simply stood there staring downward into the light, trying to process the scale of what he was seeing. The staircase alone looked industrial grade. Reinforced steel disappearing far deeper underground than should be even been possible beneath the forge. Then he noticed something sitting beside the opening. A small black envelope resting on the edge of the newly opened platform. His name was written across the front. Ethan. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Victor Kane knew exactly who would find this place. Ethan picked up the envelope slowly. Inside was a single handwritten note in Victor's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. If you were reading this, then you were right about one thing after all. Real value is built, not inherited. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then his eyes drifted back toward the staircase descending into the hidden structure below. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized Victor Kane might have understood him far better than he ever let anyone believe. Ethan didn't go down into the underground structure immediately. As strange as it sounded later, fear actually kept him standing at the edge of the staircase for a long time. Not panic. Not horror movie fear, something quieter than that. The kind of fear that comes when your entire understanding of someone suddenly starts changing underneath your feet. Because Victor Kane had planned this. Every part of it. The furnace, the inheritance, even Ethan himself. The realization settled heavily into his chest as he stared down the steel staircase disappearing into the mountain below Blackforge. The old man hadn't left clues randomly. He had engineered this entire thing specifically for one person to find. Someone who understood steel heat, craftsmanship, someone exactly like Ethan. The underground lights hummed softly beneath him while warm air drifted upward from below. Whatever existed under Blackforge clearly still had power. Climate control too, judging by the temperature difference alone. Which meant Victor Kane hadn't abandoned this place. He'd maintained it in secret for years. Ethan finally descended the stairs slowly, flashlight still clenched tightly in one hand despite the lights below. His boots echoed against steel steps as he moved deeper underground. The staircase continued far longer than expected, eventually opening into a massive reinforced corridor lined with industrial concrete and black steel support beams. Everything looked pristine, not new but preserved with obsessive care. No dust. No rust. No decay. It felt less like entering a hidden bunker and more like stepping into a forgotten museum buried beneath a mountain. Then Ethan entered the main chamber and stopped breathing for a second. The room was enormous, far larger than anything that should be physically fit underneath Blackforge. High ceilings disappeared into shadows above rows of industrial lights. Climate-controlled glass display cases stretched across the chamber in carefully organized sections. Weapons racks lined entire walls. Steel shelves held wooden crates, stamped with shipping ports from half a dozen countries. Victor Kane hadn't hidden valuables down here. He'd hidden an empire. Ethan walked slowly past the first display case almost in disbelief. Inside rested a set of handcrafted Japanese katanas displayed on black silk mounts beneath soft overhead lighting. Even without touching them, Ethan could tell immediately they were authentic, real folded steel, centuries old, museum-level craftsmanship. The next case held Civil War-era revolvers in near-perfect condition. Another contained ceremonial European sabers covered in gold detailing. Then came the armor. Entire suits of historical armor stood mounted upright beneath spotlights like silent soldiers guarding the chamber. Samurai armor. Medieval European plate armor, Ottoman blades, rare firearms Ethan recognized from private collector catalogs worth millions on their own. And this was only one section of the vault, and turned slowly in stunned silence. Victor Kane had spent decades secretly collecting historical weapons and artifacts from across the world. Not replicas. Originals. Some of these pieces were supposed to be lost. Others legally couldn't even exist in private collections anymore. Then Ethan noticed the central display. Unlike everything else in the chamber, this section stood isolated beneath its own lighting system in the middle of the room. A single black steel pedestal rested inside reinforced glass, and on it sat a sword unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. The scabbard alone looked ancient, matte black with silver detailing worn smooth from age. The handle was wrapped in dark leather faded nearly gray over time. But it was the blade itself that pulled Ethan closer. Even beneath protective glass, the steel looked different. Darker. The folded metal patterns running along the blade almost resembled smoke trapped inside the steel itself. A small brass plaque beneath the display simply read, Nightfall. Ethan stared at the sword for several long seconds before finally noticing another envelope sitting beside the display case. His name again. Ethan. Of course. Victor Kane never missed details. Ethan opened the envelope carefully. Inside sat several pages handwritten by Victor himself. If you were standing here now, then the family reacted exactly the way I expected, the letter began. Daniel and Olivia would never resist easy money. They inherited greed long before they inherited my name. Ethan frowned slightly and continued reading. The collection upstairs was bait, valuable enough to tempt them, traceable enough to destroy them. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Upstairs. Then he remembered something suddenly. The secondary storage room near Blackforge's west wing. Earlier that morning he'd noticed signs someone had forced entry months ago, but hadn't thought much about it at the time. Victor already knew. The old man continued. By now they've likely already taken the marked artifacts hidden in the decoy vault. If they attempt to move them through private collectors or overseas auction houses, federal agencies will flag the transactions immediately. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. Holy hell. Victor Kane had set them up. Not emotionally. Legally. The realization hit Ethan like cold water. The decoy collection wasn't treasure. It was evidence. Victor had intentionally left stolen or illegally documented artifacts where Daniel and Olivia could find them first, knowing exactly what they would do. And if Ethan understood his family at all, they absolutely would be taken them. The deeper Ethan read, the darker the letter became. Apparently several artifacts in the decoy vault had already been quietly connected to ongoing international investigations involving black market antiquities trafficking. Victor himself had apparently cooperated privately with federal authorities years earlier under sealed agreements. The marked pieces carried hidden forensic identifiers impossible to remove without destroying them entirely, meaning the second Daniel or Olivia tried selling them, they were finished. Ethan sat down slowly at the edge of a nearby workbench, trying to process the sheer level of manipulation involved. Victor Kane planned this all before he died. Every move, every reaction, every temptation. And somehow that wasn't even the craziest part. Because underneath all the manipulation, Ethan could finally see the truth hidden beneath Victor's cruelty. The old man never trusted his own family. Not really. Not with money. Not with legacy. Not with history. But Ethan. Victor trusted Ethan to preserve something. To build something. That was the difference. A sudden vibration from Ethan's phone broke the silence underground. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. Yeah? The voice on the other end sounded tense. Mr. Kane. This is Special Agent Ramirez with the Denver field office. I apologize for contacting you directly, but we need to ask several questions regarding Daniel Kane and Olivia Kane. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. It had already started. Ramirez continued. Earlier today, customs officials flagged an attempted private transfer involving historically protected artifacts connected to your grandfather's estate. Not grandfather. Victor. The word still felt strange now. Ethan leaned back against the cold steel wall beside him while listening quietly. Federal seizure warrants, fraud investigations, international trafficking violations. The list kept growing. Apparently Daniel and Olivia moved fast after the will reading. Too fast. Confident they'd outsmarted everyone, they attempted selling pieces from the decoy collection through a private buyer in Switzerland only 48 hours earlier. Exactly like Victor predicted. Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was terrifying. Even dead Victor Kane was still controlling the room. After the call ended, Ethan sat silently underground for a long time staring at the sword-labeled Nightfall beneath the glass display. Then finally his eyes drifted back toward Victor's final handwritten paragraph. The family believed wealth was ownership. They were wrong. Ownership belongs to the person capable of protecting what matters when everyone else sees only profit. For the first time in years, Ethan understood what Victor Kane had really been trying to build. Not a business empire. A legacy strong enough to survive his own bloodline. The snow came early that year in Colorado. By late October, the mountains surrounding Black Forge were already buried beneath heavy white layers of ice and frozen pine. Most mornings Ethan woke before sunrise to the sound of wind scraping against the steel walls of the forge, while the old furnace downstairs burned hot enough to shake warmth through the entire structure. 3 months earlier, the place had looked like a graveyard. Now it looked alive again. Not restored. Not yet. But alive. The roof over the main forge had been repaired enough to survive winter. Broken windows were replaced. The old electrical systems had been rewired section by section. Massive industrial lights now hung over worktables that Ethan slowly brought back use one machine at a time. The air no longer smelled like rotten abandonment. It smelled like steel again, burned coal, hot iron, oil. Work. Real work. For the first time in years, Ethan actually felt like he belonged somewhere. And the craziest part was that he still hadn't even cataloged half the underground collection beneath Black Forge. Every week he discovered something new hidden inside Victor Kane's vault. Crates filled with historical weapons thought destroyed decades ago. Rare prototypes from private military collections. Handwritten documents connected to old industrial families nobody alive even remembered anymore. Some items clearly belonged in museums. Others probably should be terrified him more than they did. But one thing became obvious very quickly. Victor Kane's secret collection wasn't built for money alone. It was obsession. The old man had spent decades preserving pieces of history the rest of the world either lost, sold, or forgot. And somehow, against all logic, he trusted Ethan with it. The thought still sat strangely in Ethan's chest some nights. Because Victor Kane had never been a warm man, never gentle, never openly proud. Even his final gift came wrapped inside manipulation traps and psychological warfare. But buried underneath all that cruelty was something Ethan only now understood. Respect. Victor never respected businessmen. Not really. He respected builders. Creators. People capable of making something with their own hands. That was why Black Forge existed. That was why Ethan inherited it. The outside world, meanwhile, was collapsing around the Kane family exactly the way Victor predicted. Every news network in the country eventually picked up the story. Kane heirs under federal investigation became headline material almost overnight. Financial reporters practically salivated over it. Daniel Kane and Olivia Kane had apparently attempted moving several marked artifacts through private overseas auctions before federal authorities intercepted the transfers. Once investigators started pulling records, everything unraveled fast. Money laundering, fraud, illegal antiquities trafficking, tax evasion. The deeper agencies dug, the uglier things became. Daniel lost his board position at Kane Industries within days. Investors fled. Lawsuits followed immediately after. Olivia's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Federal subpoenas hit the family's attorneys so aggressively that several long-time Kane executives quietly resigned before they could be dragged into hearings themselves. And through all of it, Ethan stayed hidden in the mountains. He ignored interview requests, ignored reporters, ignored the endless voicemails from lawyers trying to clarify ownership of Blackforge and its contents. For once in his life, he wanted no part of the Kane machine. Then one afternoon, right as the first major snowstorm rolled over the mountains, a black SUV appeared at the end of the long dirt road leading to the forge. Ethan already knew who it was before the vehicle even stopped. Daniel stepped out first. Even from a distance, he looked older, smaller somehow. The expensive confidence he wore so naturally in Manhattan had vanished completely. His tailored coats were gone, replaced by a plain dark jacket dusted with snow. Olivia climbed out beside him wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky, though Ethan could still see exhaustion written all over her face. Neither of them looked rich anymore. They looked hunted. Ethan stayed where he was near the forge entrance, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag, while the two of them slowly approached through the snow. For a moment nobody spoke. The wind howled softly through the mountains around them. Finally Daniel broke the silence. "You disappeared." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Didn't realize anybody was looking for me." Olivia looked up at Blackforge behind him. Smoke drifted from the repaired furnace chimney into the gray winter sky. Lights glowed warmly through the restored windows. The place no longer looked abandoned. It looked powerful. "You found something here," she said quietly. Not a question. Ethan said nothing. Daniel exhaled hard, glancing away toward the mountains before speaking again. "The government froze everything." His voice sounded hollow now. "Kane Industries is being dismantled piece by piece. They seized Olivia's accounts. They're reinvestigating Dad's offshore holdings. Every attorney we had is trying to save themselves first." Ethan leaned casually against the forge doorway. "Sounds expensive." Daniel flinched slightly at that. Good, because for the first time in Ethan's life, Daniel Kane finally understood what helplessness felt like. Olivia stepped forward next. "Victor set us up." "No," Ethan replied calmly. "Victor gave you exactly what you wanted." "That's not fair." Ethan almost laughed at that. "Fair?" he repeated. "You two broke into Blackforge before the will was even finalized. You stole artifacts you thought were worth millions. You tried selling them before Victor's body was even in the ground." Neither of them answered, because they knew he was right. Snow drifted sideways across the yard between them. Finally Daniel spoke again, quieter this time. "We know there's more here." Of course he did. Men like Daniel always assumed hidden wealth existed somewhere nearby. "That sword on the news," Daniel continued carefully. "Nightfall. They're re-saying collectors offered over $100 million for it already." Ethan's expression never changed, but inside something clicked into place. Even now, after losing everything, Daniel still only saw value in numbers. Victor Kane truly understood his children better than anyone. Olivia took another slow step closer. "You could help us." There it was. Not apology. Not regret. Need. Ethan looked past them toward the mountains surrounding Blackforge. Snow covered everything now. Silent forests, frozen cliffs, endless white stretching toward the horizon. Strange how peaceful the world could look while entire empires collapsed somewhere far below. Then he looked back at his family. "You know what the difference is between me and Victor?" Ethan asked quietly. Neither answered. "He built an empire because he trusted nobody. I'm rebuilding this place because I finally know exactly who not to trust." Daniel's jaw tightened. Olivia looked away first. And for the first time since arriving at Blackforge, Ethan realized he no longer felt angry at them anymore. Just finished. The furnace roared behind him from somewhere deep inside the forge, sending sparks briefly upward through the chimney into the falling snow. Warmth against winter. Life against ruin. Ethan stepped backward toward the entrance. "You should go," he said calmly. "Storm's getting worse." Daniel stared at him another few seconds, maybe still hoping family guilt or sympathy might somehow appear at the last second. It didn't. Eventually the two of them turned and walked back toward the SUV in silence, while snow swallowed their footprints almost immediately behind them. Ethan watched until the vehicle disappeared completely down the mountain road. Then he turned back toward Blackforge. toward the heat, toward the sound of steel, and deep beneath his feet, hidden safely under layers of reinforced concrete and mountain stone, Victor Kane's true legacy waited in silence, not as treasure to be spent, but as history finally placed in the hands of someone capable of protecting it. What I love most about this story is that the real treasure was never just the vault, the weapons, or the money hidden beneath Blackforge. The real treasure was perspective. Everyone in Victor Kane's family looked at life the same way. They saw value only in things that looked expensive on the surface. Big buildings, luxury accounts, fast money, easy power. Ethan was the only person willing to look deeper, and because of that, he became the only one capable of finding something real. I think that lesson applies to real life more than most people realize. A lot of us spend years chasing whatever the world tells us looks successful from the outside. More money, better titles, bigger status. And sometimes we get so distracted by appearances that we completely overlook the things that actually matter: our skills, our character, our patience, and the ability to build something meaningful with our own hands. What made Ethan different wasn't luck, it wasn't inheritance. It was the fact that he spent years mastering something nobody around him respected. While everyone else chased shortcuts, he learned a craft, he paid attention to details, he developed real knowledge. And in the end, that quiet discipline became worth more than all the flashy wealth his family fought over. There's also another truth hidden in this story that honestly hits even harder: greed blinds people. Daniel and Olivia weren't destroyed because they were unlucky. They destroyed themselves the moment they believed they were smarter than everyone else. The second people become obsessed with winning at all costs, they stop asking whether they are losing themselves in the process. And real life works like that too. Sometimes the people moving the fastest toward money are actually walking straight into traps they can't even see yet. But Ethan's story reminds us of something hopeful. Just because people underestimate you doesn't mean your path has less value. Sometimes the things others laugh at today become the exact reason you succeed tomorrow. Skills matter, integrity matters, patience matters, and often, the people who quietly keep building while everyone else chases appearances are the ones who eventually create the strongest foundation for themselves. At the end of the day, Blackforge wasn't really about hidden treasure. It was about becoming the kind of person capable of recognizing treasure when everyone else walks right past it.